In the dead of night, when most pilots grounded their aircraft and waited for dawn, she became unstoppable. They called her Ghost as a joke, the quiet woman who barely spoke during briefings, who seemed to disappear into shadows during social gatherings, who flew missions others considered impossible in complete darkness. Her fellow pilots snickered behind her back, convinced her call sign was more about her personality than her skills. They stopped laughing the night she single-handedly turned the tide of a siege that had lasted 3 months. Major Sarah Chun never asked to be underestimated. Born to immigrant parents who sacrificed everything for her education, she learned early that proving herself required more than just meeting expectations. She had to exceed them in ways that left no room for doubt. When she earned her wings as one of only 12 women in a class of 200 military aviators, the whispers followed her to every assignment. Ghost wasn't supposed to be a compliment. It was what they called someone who couldn't command respect, couldn't lead from the front, couldn't inspire confidence in high-stakes operations. But Sarah Chun transformed that mockery into something that would strike fear into enemy forces across 3 continents. This is the story of how a woman dismissed as invisible became the most feared night fighter in modern military history. How she took a call sign meant to diminish her and turned it into a legend that enemy combatants would whisper about in terror. How one pilot's mastery of darkness changed the outcome of conflicts that historians still study today. The laughter died the moment she proved that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage of all. Sarah Chin's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel outside Randolph Air Force Base. At 22, she was about to walk into a world that had been designed by men, for men, since the dawn of military aviation. The year was 1999, and while women had been flying combat missions for only 4 years, the culture hadn't caught up to the policy changes. Her father, David Chun, had worked 16-hour days in his small electronics repair shop to afford her college education. Her mother, Lynn, cleaned office buildings at night to pay for Sarah's flying lessons. They never complained, never made her feel guilty for choosing such an expensive dream. But Sarah felt the weight of their sacrifice every time she buckled into a cockpit. The moment she stepped into the squadron-ready room, conversation stopped. 23 male pilots turned to stare at the small Asian woman carrying a flight bag that looked almost as big as she was. Sarah stood 5'4" and weighed barely 115 pounds. Next to the broad-shouldered, 6-foot-tall aviators around her, she looked like a child playing dress-up in flight gear. "You must be lost, sweetheart," called out Captain Jake Morrison, a cocky F-16 pilot with more swagger than skill. "The nurse's station is in the medical building." Laughter rippled through the room. Sarah set down her bag and looked Morrison directly in the eyes. "Second Lieutenant Chun, reporting for duty, sir." Her voice was quiet but steady. Colonel Frank Hayes, the squadron commander, emerged from his office. A 25-year veteran with graying temples and kind eyes, he had specifically requested Sarah for his unit after reviewing her training records. "That's enough, Morrison. Chun, welcome to the Fighting Eagles. You'll be flying number 4 position in Bravo flight." The assignment to number 4 position was telling. In military aviation, the most junior, least experienced pilot typically flew as number 4, the tail end of the formation, responsible for following orders rather than making tactical decisions. It was where they put pilots they didn't quite trust yet. Sarah's instructor during flight training, Captain Maria Rodriguez, had warned her about this moment. "They're going to test you in every way possible," Rodriguez had said during their last training session. "Not just your flying skills, but your resolve, your confidence, your ability to function under pressure that has nothing to do with flying and everything to do with proving you belong." The testing began immediately. During her first week, Sarah discovered that someone had tampered with her flight gear, loosening straps and adjusting settings in ways that would be uncomfortable but not dangerous. Her assigned aircraft always seemed to need unexpected maintenance right before important training missions. When she walked into the dining hall, conversations would stop, then resume in whispers. But Sarah had learned patience from her parents. She watched, listened, and adapted. She arrived an hour early for every briefing, stayed an hour late to review flight procedures. While her squadron mates drank beer at the officers' club, she studied weather patterns, enemy tactics, and aircraft performance specifications. Her flight leader, Major Tom Bradley, was a competent pilot, but harbored deep reservations about flying with a woman. During her first training mission, he assigned her the simplest tasks: maintaining formation position, following radio procedures, staying quiet unless directly addressed. Ghost, maintain bearing 270, altitude 15,000. Bradley commanded over the radio during a routine formation flight. Ghost. Sarah questioned the unfamiliar call sign. That's your new handle, rookie. You're so quiet during briefings. We figured you must be invisible. The other pilots in the formation chuckled over the radio. Sarah understood immediately that Ghost wasn't meant as a compliment. In military aviation culture, call signs typically reflected either remarkable achievements or embarrassing failures. Hers clearly fell into the latter category. But Sarah decided that if they wanted to call her Ghost, she would make them understand what that really meant. She began requesting night flying assignments. While other pilots preferred daylight missions where visibility was unlimited and risks were reduced, Sarah gravitated toward the darkness. She studied night vision technology with the intensity of a graduate student preparing for doctoral exams. She memorized the performance characteristics of various aircraft in low-light conditions. Most importantly, she developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate and fight in complete darkness. Her first real test came 3 months into her assignment. The squadron was tasked with a night interdiction mission, intercepting enemy aircraft that were reportedly smuggling weapons across a contested border region. Intelligence suggested the smugglers operated only on moonless nights, using terrain masking and radio silence to avoid detection. Major Bradley assigned Sarah to fly defensive patrol on the periphery of the operation area. Stay on station, Ghost. Call out anything you see, but don't engage unless specifically ordered. As the mission progressed, Sarah monitored radio communications while maintaining her assigned patrol route. The primary interdiction team reported negative contact for 2 hours. Enemy aircraft were either not operating that night, or they were being far more careful than intelligence had suggested. Then, Sarah noticed something on her radar scope, a faint, intermittent contact moving low and fast through a mountain valley 30 miles from the main search area. The signature was barely visible, appearing and disappearing as the unknown aircraft wove between peaks and ridges. Control, Ghost as possible contact, bearing 045, range 30 miles, altitude unknown, she reported. Ghost, are you certain? We're not showing anything in that sector, came a skeptical response from the mission controller. Sarah studied her scope more carefully. The contact was definitely there, but it was using terrain masking expertly, appearing only when it crested ridges before diving back into valleys. This wasn't amateur flying. Someone with serious skill was piloting that aircraft. Control, contact is confirmed. Request permission to investigate. Negative, Ghost. Maintain assigned patrol area. Sarah faced a critical decision. Follow orders and let a potential enemy aircraft escape, or trust her instincts and pursue what might be exactly what they were looking for. She thought about her parents' sacrifices, about the snickers and whispered comments about the call sign that was supposed to diminish her. Control, Ghost is experiencing radio difficulty. Signal breaking up. She turned off her radio and banked toward the mysterious contact. Flying at night through mountainous terrain without radio contact violated multiple safety protocols. But Sarah had spent countless hours studying these mountains, memorizing peak elevations, valley configurations, and safe transit routes. She descended to 500 feet above ground level and began pursuing the unknown aircraft using only her radar and night vision systems. The chase lasted 23 minutes. Sarah matched her quarry's every maneuver, staying just close enough to maintain radar contact without revealing her position. The enemy pilot was skilled, using techniques that suggested military training. But Sarah had advantages he didn't know about. She had memorized the terrain so thoroughly that she could predict his likely escape routes. More importantly, she had learned to fly in darkness with a precision that bordered on supernatural. While the enemy pilot was fighting the night, Sarah had become part of it. When the smuggler's aircraft finally emerged from the mountains and turned toward international airspace, Sarah was waiting. She lit him up with her targeting radar and delivered a warning that stopped his escape cold. Unknown aircraft, you're being illuminated by military targeting systems. Turn to heading 270 immediately, or you will be engaged. The enemy pilot, realizing he had been completely outmaneuvered, surrendered immediately. When Sarah returned to base with her prisoner, the squadron was waiting. Major Bradley stood with his arms crossed, clearly preparing to deliver a reprimand for breaking radio contact and leaving her assigned patrol area. Colonel Hayes emerged from the operations center with a slight smile. Outstanding work, Lieutenant. That aircraft was carrying enough weapons to supply a terrorist cell for 6 months. The ready room fell silent. Sarah had just accomplished what the entire primary interdiction team had failed to do, and she had done it by trusting her instincts and capabilities rather than following conservative orders. Captain Morrison, the same pilot who had mocked her on her first day, approached with a grudging expression of respect. How did you even see that guy? Our whole team was looking in the wrong place. Sarah set down her helmet and looked around the room at faces that had changed from skeptical to curious. Sometimes being invisible helps you see things others miss. That night, Ghost stopped being a joke. It became something else entirely, a call sign that represented stealth, precision, and an almost supernatural ability to operate in conditions where other pilots struggled to survive. But this was just the beginning. Sarah Chun was about to discover that her mastery of darkness would be tested in ways she never imagined, in conflicts where the stakes were measured in lives rather than training scores. The woman they had underestimated was about to become a legend. 6 months later, Sarah received orders that would change everything. The Pentagon was forming an experimental night operations unit, tasked with developing new tactics for combat in complete darkness. Traditional military doctrine avoided night operations whenever possible due to their complexity and danger. But emerging threats required new approaches, and the military needed pilots who could master what others feared. Sarah's success with the weapon smuggler had caught the attention of senior commanders. When Colonel Hayes called her into his office, she expected another routine assignment. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with Brigadier General Patricia Wells, one of the highest-ranking women in the Air Force. Lieutenant Chun, I've reviewed your training records and recent mission reports. How do you feel about working in an environment where failure isn't just career-ending? It's potentially fatal. Sarah considered the question carefully. Ma'am, I believe the greatest risks often come from refusing to take calculated chances when the situation demands it. General Wells smiled. That's exactly the answer I was hoping for. You're being transferred to Edwards Air Force Base to join Project Nighthawk. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. Project Nighthawk was developing revolutionary night combat capabilities. The unit would test new aircraft modifications, experimental targeting systems, and tactics that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in darkness. The assignment came with unusual autonomy. Pilots would be expected to make independent tactical decisions in situations where traditional command structures might not function. Sarah's new squadron commander was Colonel Richard Hawk Peterson, a legendary pilot who had earned his reputation during covert operations that officially never happened. Unlike the skepticism she had faced at Randolph, Peterson welcomed her with professional respect. I don't care if you're a man, woman, or trained chimpanzee, he said during her first briefing. What matters is whether you can execute missions that other pilots consider impossible. Your record suggests you can. Now prove it. The training was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Night flights in conditions that would normally ground all aircraft. navigation exercises using minimal instruments in complete darkness, combat simulations where pilots had to engage multiple targets while avoiding obstacles that couldn't be seen until the last possible moment. Sarah excelled, but the real test came during her first operational deployment. Intelligence had identified a terrorist training camp in a remote mountain region where conventional attacks had failed. The enemy had positioned their facility in a location that made traditional airstrikes nearly impossible, nestled between two peaks with minimal approach routes and extensive air defense systems. Multiple attempts by conventional forces had failed. Daylight approaches were detected miles away, giving defenders time to hide in caves and tunnels. High-altitude bombing couldn't achieve the precision needed to destroy the facility without killing innocent civilians in a nearby village. This is why Nighthawk exists, Colonel Peterson explained during the mission briefing. We need surgical precision in conditions where others can't even find a target. Sarah studied the terrain maps and intelligence photos for hours. The target was accessible through a narrow valley that twisted between mountain peaks like a serpentine corridor. Enemy radar installations covered the most obvious approach routes, but there was one possibility, a route that would require flying barely 50 feet above ground level through the valley in complete darkness, using only passive sensors to avoid detection. It's suicide, declared Major Kevin Walsh, the squadron's most experienced pilot. One mistake, and you're a grease spot on a mountainside. Maybe, Sarah replied quietly. But it's the only approach they won't expect. She spent 3 days preparing for the mission. Sarah memorized every twist in the valley, every peak elevation, every potential hazard. She practiced low-level night navigation until she could fly the route in her sleep. Most importantly, she studied the enemy's defensive patterns until she understood their blind spots and reaction times. The night of the mission, weather conditions were perfect for stealth operations. Overcast skies, no moon, visibility near zero. Sarah's aircraft had been modified with the latest passive navigation systems and noise reduction technology. She would approach the target in complete radio silence, relying entirely on her own judgment and skills. At 0300 hours, Sarah entered the mountain valley flying at 100 feet above ground level, moving through darkness that was so complete she couldn't see her own wing tips. Her instruments provided minimal information. She was essentially flying blind, using only terrain-following radar to avoid crashing into the mountains that rose on either side of her flight path. The valley twisted and turned like a maze. Sarah banked left around one peak, then immediately rolled right to follow the terrain contours. Her aircraft was traveling at nearly 300 miles per hour through a corridor that was sometimes less than a quarter-mile wide. One navigation error would be instantly fatal. 20 minutes into the approach, her passive sensors detected the first enemy radar installation. The system was sweeping the valley entrance, but Sarah was already past the detection zone, threading through terrain that the enemy had assumed was impassable for aircraft. She climbed slightly to clear a ridge, then descended back into the valley approach. According to her calculations, the target should be visible in approximately 30 seconds. Sarah prepared her weapons systems and began looking for the thermal signatures that would identify the terrorist facility. Then she saw it. Heat signatures from buildings, vehicles, and human activity clustered in a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcroppings. Intelligence photos hadn't done justice to how well hidden the camp was. Nestled against the mountainside, it would be nearly invisible even during daylight. Sarah had one opportunity. Her approach route would bring her directly over the target for approximately 10 seconds before the terrain forced her to climb out of the valley. In those 10 seconds, she needed to identify and engage multiple targets with precision that would destroy the terrorist facility without damaging the nearby village. She activated her targeting systems and began acquiring locks on the primary structures. The terrorist camp included a main command building, weapons storage facilities, and training areas. Sarah's mission was to eliminate the camp's operational capability while minimizing collateral damage. Her weapons systems indicated multiple target locks. Sarah took a breath and squeezed the trigger. The night erupted in precisely controlled destruction. Her missiles struck their targets with surgical accuracy, eliminating the terrorist facility in a series of explosions that lit up the mountain valley. Within seconds, the command center, weapons storage, and training facilities were destroyed. But Sarah's escape was just beginning. The explosions had alerted every enemy air defense system in the region. As she climbed out of the valley, surface-to-air missiles began launching from previously unknown positions. The night sky filled with deadly projectiles seeking her aircraft. Sarah dove back toward the mountain peaks, using the terrain to break missile locks and confuse targeting systems. She rolled inverted and flew between ridgelines, pulling gravity forces that would have caused most pilots to lose consciousness. Emergency warnings filled her cockpit as she pushed her aircraft beyond normal operating limits. 3 missiles passed within 50 feet of her aircraft. Sarah continued weaving through the mountains, using every peak and valley to mask her position. She flew for 45 minutes through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, with multiple enemy systems trying to destroy her. When she finally emerged from the mountain region and entered friendly airspace, Sarah's aircraft had been damaged by near-miss explosions and overstressed by extreme maneuvering. But she was alive, and the mission was a complete success. The terrorist training camp had been eliminated with 0 civilian casualties. Intelligence analysts later confirmed that the operation had disrupted planned attacks against civilian targets that would have killed hundreds of innocent people. More importantly, Sarah had proven that night operations in impossible conditions weren't just theoretically possible. They could be executed with devastating effectiveness by pilots with the right training and mindset. Colonel Peterson was waiting when she landed. Outstanding work, Ghost. How did you maintain navigation accuracy through that valley approach? Sarah considered the question as she shut down her aircraft systems. Sir, when you truly understand the darkness, it stops being an obstacle and becomes an advantage. Word of the mission spread quickly through military aviation circles. The quiet lieutenant who had been dismissed as Ghost had just accomplished something that seasoned combat veterans considered impossible. She had penetrated enemy territory that was supposed to be impregnable, eliminated a high-value target with surgical precision, and escaped through a gauntlet of air defenses that should have destroyed her aircraft. But Sarah knew this was still just preparation. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, she would face challenges that would test not just her flying skills, but her courage, judgment, and commitment to values that her parents had instilled in her since childhood. The woman they had underestimated was becoming something the enemy would learn to fear. 2 years into her assignment with Project Nighthawk, Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end belonged to her mother, Lin Shun, but the words were spoken in Mandarin, a language Sarah's parents had taught her but rarely used at home. Your father is in the hospital, Lin said carefully. Heart attack. The doctors say he will recover, but the shop, we may lose everything. Sarah's father had suffered a major cardiac event while working late in his electronics repair shop. The medical bills, combined with lost income during his recovery, threatened to destroy the small business that had supported Sarah's education and dreams. Her parents had never asked her for financial help, had never made her feel obligated to support them. But Sarah knew that without intervention, they would lose everything they had worked for. She requested emergency leave and flew home to California. Walking into the hospital room where her father lay connected to monitors and for lines, Sarah saw the man who had sacrificed everything for her education looking fragile and old. You should not be here, David Shun said weakly. Your career is important. We will manage. Sarah took her father's hand. The Air Force will always be there. You and Mom are what matter most. She spent a week helping organize her parents' finances and medical care. The numbers were stark. Her father's recovery would take months, possibly longer. The electronic shop generated barely enough income to support basic living expenses even when David was healthy. Medical bills would consume their savings within weeks. Sarah faced an impossible choice. She could request a transfer to a base near her parents, accepting a career-limiting assignment that would allow her to help financially support her family. Or she could continue with Nighthawk, knowing that her parents might lose everything while she pursued military advancement. The decision became even more complicated when Colonel Peterson called with news of a critical mission assignment. "Ghost, we've got a situation in Eastern Europe that requires your specific skill set. I can't provide details over an unsecured line, but this is the kind of operation that Nighthawk was created to handle." Sarah explained her family situation to the colonel. "Sir, I may need to request reassignment to help my parents through this crisis." Peterson was quiet for a long moment. "Lieutenant, I understand family obligations, but I also need to tell you that this mission could prevent a conflict that would cost thousands of lives. Take 48 hours to decide. Whatever you choose, you'll have my support." That night, Sarah sat with her parents in their small apartment above the electronics shop. The three of them spoke honestly about money, sacrifice, and the dreams they had all pursued together. "When we came to America," her mother said slowly, "we knew that success would require sacrifices from all of us. You have become something extraordinary. We did not invest in your education, so you could abandon your responsibilities when we face difficulties." "But if I stay in the Air Force," Sarah replied, "you might lose the shop, your home, everything you've worked for." Her father struggled to sit up straighter in his chair. "Daughter, what we built can be replaced. What you have achieved cannot. There are problems only you can solve, people only you can help. We will find another way." Sarah spent a sleepless night walking through the neighborhood where she had grown up, thinking about duty, sacrifice, and the weight of other people's expectations. In the morning, she made her decision. She arranged for a significant portion of her military pay to be automatically transferred to her parents' account. It would cover their immediate medical expenses and provide support during her father's recovery, though it would mean financial hardship for Sarah herself. Then she called Colonel Peterson and accepted the mission assignment. 3 days later, Sarah found herself in a classified briefing room receiving details about a crisis that threatened to destabilize an entire region. A rebel group had seized control of a strategic mountain pass in a disputed territory, using the position to threaten civilian population centers and disrupt international aid shipments. "The rebels have positioned anti-aircraft systems throughout the mountains," explained the intelligence briefer. "Conventional airstrikes are impossible due to terrain and civilian proximity. They're essentially holding the entire region hostage." The situation had been deteriorating for weeks. Diplomatic efforts had failed. Ground forces couldn't reach the rebel positions due to the mountainous terrain and harsh weather conditions. Previous air operations had been unsuccessful because the rebels had positioned their weapons systems in locations that were nearly impossible to target without causing massive civilian casualties. "This is where Ghost comes in," said General Wells, who had flown in specifically for the briefing. "We need someone who can operate in conditions where others can't even survive, much less fight effectively." Sarah studied the intelligence reports and terrain analysis. The rebel position was located on a mountain peak accessible only through a narrow valley that was covered by multiple air defense systems. Weather reports indicated severe storms in the region, with zero visibility and dangerous turbulence that would ground most aircraft. "Ma'am, what's the timeline for this operation?" 48 hours, General Wells replied grimly. "Intelligence suggests the rebels are planning to use chemical weapons against civilian targets. If we don't neutralize their capability within 2 days, we could be looking at thousands of casualties." Sarah felt the familiar weight of impossible expectations. Success would save lives and potentially prevent a broader conflict. Failure would mean the deaths of innocent civilians and possibly her own life. But this was exactly why she had sacrificed financial security and family proximity to remain with Nighthawk. She spent the next 36 hours in intensive preparation. The mission would require flying through a mountain storm system that meteorologists rated as extremely dangerous for aviation operations. She would need to navigate by instruments alone, using terrain-following radar to avoid crashing into peaks that she couldn't see. The Rebel Air Defense Network included both modern surface-to-air missiles and older, but still deadly anti-aircraft artillery. Sarah would need to approach the target through a corridor of defensive fire while flying in weather conditions that would challenge her aircraft's structural limits. Most critically, she would need to achieve surgical precision while engaging targets positioned dangerously close to civilian areas. Intelligence photos showed that the rebel weapons systems were deliberately placed near a refugee camp, using innocent people as human shields. On the night of the mission, Sarah performed her pre-flight inspection in driving rain and winds that made standing upright difficult. Her aircraft had been modified with enhanced navigation systems and precision weapons designed for exactly this type of scenario. Ghost, weather conditions are marginal at best, reported the mission controller. We could delay 24 hours if needed. Negative, Sarah replied. The storm provides cover for the approach. If we wait for better weather, we lose the tactical advantage. She launched into weather that would have caused commercial airlines to cancel all flights. Rain hammered her aircraft while turbulence threw her around the cockpit with forces that strained her harness and helmet system. Visibility was zero. Sarah was flying entirely on instruments through storm clouds that extended from ground level to 30,000 feet. The approach to the target required descending through the storm system into the mountain valley where rebel forces waited. Sarah's radar showed the terrain around her, but wind shear and turbulence made precise navigation extremely difficult. She was essentially flying through a washing machine filled with granite peaks. 20 miles from the target, her aircraft was struck by lightning. Electrical systems flickered as tens of thousands of volts coursed through the airframe. Sarah fought to maintain control as backup systems engaged and warning lights illuminated her cockpit. Ghost, we're reading electrical anomalies in your aircraft. Recommend aborting mission and returning to base. Sarah checked her systems. Primary navigation was functioning, weapons systems were operational, and flight controls were responding normally. The lightning strike had caused damage, but nothing that would prevent mission completion. Negative. Continuing to target. She descended through the storm into the valley where rebel forces had positioned their weapons systems. Through breaks in the clouds, Sarah could see muzzle flashes as anti-aircraft artillery attempted to track her aircraft. Surface-to-air missiles launched from multiple positions, creating streaks of light in the darkness. But the storm that made flying so dangerous also provided perfect cover for her approach. Radar systems couldn't track her effectively through the precipitation, and visual observers couldn't see her aircraft until she was already past their positions. Sarah identified her targets through thermal imaging systems, weapons installations positioned near, but not directly adjacent to the refugee camp. She would need to eliminate the rebel capability without harming innocent civilians who had been forced to shelter within a few hundred meters of military targets. Her first missile strike eliminated a surface-to-air missile launcher positioned on a rocky outcropping above the refugee camp. The explosion lit up the valley, but Sarah was already maneuvering to engage the next target. Anti-aircraft fire intensified as rebel forces realized they were under attack. Sarah flew through a web of tracers and explosions, using the storm and terrain to mask her position while systematically destroying the weapon systems that threatened civilian populations. Her final target was the rebels' command center, located in a fortified position that controlled the mountain pass. But as Sarah approached the target, she realized that the rebels had positioned civilian prisoners around the building, using human shields to prevent airstrikes. Sarah circled the target area, looking for an approach angle that would allow her to neutralize the command center without harming innocent people. The rebels' defensive fire was becoming more accurate as they adjusted to her attack patterns. Then, she spotted her opportunity, a narrow window where she could strike the command center's communications array and weapons storage while leaving the main building where prisoners were being held. It would require precision that pushed her weapons systems to their absolute limits. Sarah lined up her final attack run, flying through a storm at 200 feet above ground level. Surrounded by enemy fire, she achieved a missile hit that destroyed the rebels' operational capability while leaving their prisoners unharmed. But her escape was just beginning. With their command structure eliminated, rebel forces launched every remaining weapon in a desperate attempt to destroy her aircraft. Sarah climbed back into the storm system while surface-to-air missiles exploded around her. Lightning struck her aircraft a second time as she emerged from the valley. This time, the electrical damage was more serious. Her primary navigation system failed, and she lost radio contact with Mission Control. Sarah was alone in a mountain storm system, flying a damaged aircraft with limited instruments. She navigated by backup systems and dead reckoning for 40 minutes, fighting through turbulence that threatened to tear her aircraft apart. When she finally broke clear of the storm clouds and saw the lights of friendly territory, Sarah realized she had just accomplished something that would reshape how military forces approached impossible missions. The rebel threat had been eliminated with 0 civilian casualties. The mountain pass was reopened for international aid shipments. Most importantly, Sarah had proven that surgical precision was possible even in conditions where conventional forces couldn't operate. When she landed, General Wells was waiting with a message that made the personal sacrifices worthwhile. Ghost, intelligence reports indicate that your mission prevented a chemical weapons attack that would have killed over 3,000 civilians. Your parents should know that their daughter just saved more lives than most soldiers save in entire careers. Sarah thought about her father lying in a hospital bed, her mother working extra hours to pay medical bills, and the family business that might still be lost despite her financial support. But she also thought about 3,000 people who would wake up tomorrow because she had been willing to fly through a mountain storm that others considered unsurvivable. That night, she called her parents from the secure phone in the operations center. When her father answered, his voice was stronger than it had been since his heart attack. "Daughter, we are proud of the woman you have become. Your mother, and I knew when we sacrificed for your education that you would use your abilities to help others. We have never regretted those choices." Sarah realized that her parents understood something she was still learning. That true success wasn't measured by financial gain or career advancement, but by the willingness to accept responsibility for problems that only she could solve. The woman they had called Ghost was becoming something more than a skilled pilot. She was becoming a guardian who operated in the darkness where others feared to go, protecting people who would never know her name or understand the sacrifices required to keep them safe. Captain Sarah Chun, she had been promoted after the Eastern European mission, stood in the Joint Operations Center staring at satellite images that showed a humanitarian crisis unfolding in real time. The coastal city of Maravita, home to nearly 200,000 civilians, had been under siege for 87 days. Rebel forces had completely surrounded the city, cutting off all supply routes and preventing evacuation of civilians. International aid organizations estimated that food supplies would last less than 2 weeks. Medical facilities had exhausted their resources treating wounded civilians and were beginning to shut down critical services. Multiple attempts to break the siege had failed. Ground forces couldn't penetrate the rebel defensive positions without massive civilian casualties. Naval approaches were blocked by minefields and coastal artillery. Airdrops of supplies had proven ineffective because rebels controlled the drop zones and confiscated most materials before they reached civilian populations. "The situation is becoming desperate," reported Colonel Martinez, the humanitarian aid coordinator. "We're looking at mass starvation within 10 days if we can't establish a reliable supply corridor." Sarah studied the intelligence maps showing rebel positions around the city. The enemy had chosen their defensive positions expertly, using terrain and civilian structures to create overlapping fields of fire that made conventional attacks nearly impossible. What about precision night strikes against key defensive positions? Asked General Morrison, the operation commander. We've analyzed that option, replied the intelligence officer. The rebels have positioned their weapons systems in schools, hospitals, and residential areas. Any airstrikes would cause significant civilian casualties. Sarah continued examining the maps, focusing on the geographical features around Maravita. The city was built on a peninsula that extended into a large bay. Rebel forces controlled the narrow neck of land connecting the peninsula to the mainland, effectively trapping the civilian population. Ma'am, what about a water approach? Sarah asked. Colonel Martinez shook his head. Naval vessels can't approach the harbor due to mines and coastal artillery. The rebels have anti-ship missiles positioned throughout the waterfront. Sarah pointed to a section of coastline north of the city. I'm not talking about large ships. What if we could establish a supply route using small boats operating at night? The coastal waters are too shallow for most vessels, the intelligence officer replied. Plus, the rebels have patrol boats monitoring the entire coastline. Sarah studied the charts more carefully. The shallow waters that prevented large ships from approaching might actually provide an advantage for a different kind of operation. Small boats with shallow drafts could navigate areas where enemy patrol vessels couldn't follow. General Morrison, I request permission to develop an unconventional supply mission. What do you have in mind, Captain? Sarah outlined her concept during an impromptu briefing session. Rather than attempting to overcome the rebels' defensive positions, she proposed using their tactical assumptions against them. Enemy forces expected supply runs to follow predictable patterns. Large aircraft during daylight, ships approaching the main harbor, ground convoys using established roads. What if we use small boats operating in shallow water, guided by aircraft providing navigation and security? How would aircraft help with boats? Asked Colonel Martinez. Sarah had been thinking about this problem for weeks, ever since the siege began. An aircraft could scout ahead of the boats, identify patrol vessels, and provide early warning of threats. More importantly, if rebels tried to intercept the boats, air support could eliminate the threat without the collateral damage concerns that prevent us from attacking land-based positions. General Morrison looked skeptical. Captain, coordinating aircraft and boats in a complex night operation sound extremely dangerous. One navigation error could result in friendly fire incidents. Sir, I've been working on close air support techniques that could make this feasible. Give me 72 hours to develop a detailed operational plan. Sarah spent the next 3 days immersed in technical planning that pushed the boundaries of conventional military doctrine. Her concept required unprecedented coordination between aircraft and maritime assets, operating in darkness through waters that were barely navigable even during ideal conditions. The key innovation was using aircraft-mounted laser designation systems to guide boats through safe channels while simultaneously providing targeting data for precision strikes against enemy patrol vessels. Sarah had been experimenting with this technology during training missions, developing techniques that allowed aircraft to serve as both navigator and protector for surface assets. This is the most complex night operation ever attempted, admitted Commander Patricia Nash, the Navy Special Operations Officer assigned to provide boat support. Are you certain this is achievable? Sarah considered the question honestly. Ma'am, I'm certain that conventional approaches have failed and people are dying. This operation has risks, but the alternative is watching 200,000 civilians starve. General Morrison approved the mission with reluctant recognition that desperate circumstances required desperate measures. Sarah would lead a flight of 3 aircraft providing security and navigation for a flotilla of 6 small boats carrying critical medical supplies and food. The operation was scheduled for the new moon phase, when darkness would be complete, but tides would allow the boats to navigate the shallow coastal waters. Sarah spent 48 hours memorizing every detail of the coastline, tidal patterns, and rebel patrol schedules. On the night of the mission, Sarah's aircraft took off under perfect conditions for stealth operations. Overcast skies, no moon, visibility near zero. Her two wingmen, both experienced Nighthawk pilots, maintained radio silence as they approached the operational area. Ghost Flight, this is Dolphin Lead, came the voice of Commander Nash, leading the boat flotilla. We're beginning approach to the coastline. Sarah descended to 500 feet above the water and began using her targeting systems to scan for enemy patrol boats. The rebels operated 3 vessels in the area, following predictable patterns that intelligence had mapped over weeks of observation. Dolphin Lead, Ghost 1 has contact bearing 045, range 8 miles. Patrol vessel moving northeast at 15 knots. Sarah watched the enemy boat through her targeting system while simultaneously monitoring the progress of the supply boats. The coordination required split-second timing. The boats needed to pass through specific channels during narrow windows when enemy patrols were out of position. Ghost 1, Dolphin Lead requests navigation guidance for channel approach. Sarah switched to her laser designation system and began marking the safe passage route for the boats. Her laser painted invisible markers on the water that the boat crews could see through night vision equipment, creating a highway through the darkness that avoided both enemy patrols and underwater obstacles. The supply boats moved through the shallow water like ghosts, their engines muffled and hulls painted to minimize radar reflection. Sarah maintained overwatch, ready to eliminate any threats that might compromise the mission. 20 minutes into the approach, her worst fears materialized. Ghost 1, we have a problem, reported her wingman, Captain Lisa Brooks. Enemy patrol boat is changing course, moving to intercept the supply boats. Sarah looked at her tactical display. The rebel vessel had apparently detected something and was approaching the area where the supply boats would be most vulnerable. In 5 minutes, enemy forces would be close enough to engage the boats with automatic weapons. Dolphin Lead, you have company coming. Recommend maximum speed to the harbor. Ghost 1, we're already at maximum speed. We can't outrun a patrol boat. Sarah faced a critical decision. She could eliminate the enemy patrol vessel, but the explosion might alert other rebel forces and compromise future supply runs. Alternatively, she could try to distract or disable the boat without destroying it, but that approach carried higher risks for both aircraft and boats. Ghost 2 and 3 maintain overwatch on the supply boats. Ghost 1 engaging patrol vessel. Sarah dove toward the enemy boat, using darkness and terrain masking to avoid detection until the last possible moment. Her plan was to disable the patrol vessel's engines and communications without causing casualties that might escalate the conflict. The rebel boat was a converted fishing vessel armed with heavy machine guns and crew serve weapons. As Sarah approached from their blind spot, she could see crew members searching the darkness with night vision equipment, try to locate whatever they had detected on their primitive radar system. Sarah fired a single precision missile that struck the boat's engine compartment. The explosion was controlled and surgical, enough to disable the vessel, but not enough to sink it or kill the crew. The patrol boat went dead in the water, its engines destroyed and communications equipment damaged. Dolphin Lead, threat eliminated. Continue to harbor. But Sarah's relief was short-lived. The explosion had alerted the other 2 patrol vessels, which were now converging on the area at maximum speed. Worse, coastal artillery positions had begun illuminating the water with searchlights, looking for additional targets. Ghost Flight, we've got multiple threats activating. This is about to get complicated. Sarah coordinated her 2 wingmen to engage the approaching patrol vessels while she provided cover for the supply boats during their final approach to Maravita Harbor. The next 15 minutes became a complex dance of precision strikes, evasive maneuvers, and split-second decision-making. Her wingmen eliminated both remaining patrol boats with surgical precision, while Sarah used her aircraft's defensive systems to confuse enemy radar and prevent accurate targeting by coastal artillery. The supply boats reached the harbor and began unloading critical medical supplies while rebel forces searched frantically for attackers they couldn't locate. Dolphin Lead, mission accomplished. all supplies delivered to friendly forces. The boats withdrew through the same shallow water channels, guided by Sarah's laser designation system, while her aircraft provided security overwatch. By dawn, the entire flotilla was safely away from enemy territory with 0 casualties. More importantly, the mission had proven that creative tactics could overcome seemingly impossible defensive positions. Sarah's innovative coordination of air and sea assets had established a supply route that conventional military thinking had declared impossible. "Outstanding work, Ghost," General Morrison told her during the post-mission debrief. "You've opened a corridor that could sustain the civilian population indefinitely." But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The rebels would adapt their defenses, requiring constant innovation and escalating risk. Over the following weeks, she led 7 more supply runs, each one more dangerous as enemy forces adjusted their tactics and improved their defensive capabilities. The missions became a deadly game of tactical innovation. Sarah developed new approaches for each run, different routes, different timing, different combinations of aircraft, and boat coordination. The rebels responded by increasing patrols, installing better radar systems, and positioning more sophisticated weapons around the coastline. By the 4th week of operations, Sarah's supply runs had delivered enough medical supplies and food to prevent the humanitarian crisis that had seemed inevitable just a month earlier. But the personal cost was becoming evident. She was flying missions that required 16-hour days of preparation, followed by 4-hour operations in conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. The stress of coordinating multiple assets while operating in hostile territory was taking a physical and psychological toll. "Captain, you need rest," Colonel Peterson told her after reviewing her flight logs. "You've been operating at maximum intensity for a month. Nobody can maintain this pace indefinitely." Sarah looked at the reports showing civilian mortality rates in Maravita dropping to sustainable levels for the first time since the siege began. "Sir, if we reduce the frequency of supply runs, people will start dying again. If you collapse from exhaustion, people will definitely start dying again. Take 48 hours of mandatory rest." During her enforced break, Sarah received a phone call that put everything in perspective. Her father, now recovered from his heart attack and back to working limited hours in his electronics shop, had seen news reports about the humanitarian mission in Maravita. "Daughter, your mother, and I have been following the news about the siege. We know we cannot ask about your specific role, but we want you to know that we understand why you chose to stay in the Air Force. Dad, I hope I made the right decision. Sometimes I wonder if I should have come home to help with the business. Sarah, your mother, and I came to America because we believe that individual choices could make a difference in the world. Watching you grow into a woman who accepts responsibility for problems that others cannot solve makes us proud of the sacrifices we made for your education." That night, Sarah realized that her parents' support provided strength that no amount of military training could create. She was not just a pilot anymore. She was the daughter of immigrants who had risked everything to give her opportunities they had never had. The woman they had underestimated was about to face her greatest test, a mission that would determine whether her innovations could end a siege that conventional military power had been unable to break. The laughter had stopped long ago. Now, enemy forces whispered about the ghost who appeared in darkness and disappeared before they could respond. But Sarah Chin knew that her greatest challenge was still ahead. The call came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning that would reshape modern military aviation forever. Sarah was awakened in her quarters by the red phone, reserved for emergency operations, the kind of call that meant people were dying and conventional solutions had already failed. "Ghost, this is General Morrison. We need you in the ops center immediately. The situation in Maravita has changed dramatically." Sarah dressed quickly and ran across the base to the Joint Operations Center, where she found a scene of controlled chaos. Multiple screens displayed satellite feeds, intelligence reports, and communication intercepts that painted a picture of impending catastrophe. "Here's the situation," General Morrison began grimly. Rebel forces have acquired chemical weapons and are preparing to use them against the civilian population in Maravita. Intelligence indicates they plan to launch the attack at dawn. We have less than 3 hours. Sarah studied the intelligence displays showing enemy positions around the besieged city. The rebels had positioned their chemical weapon launchers in a fortified compound that conventional forces had been unable to approach for 3 months. Sir, what about the supply corridor we've established? Can we evacuate civilians through the harbor? Colonel Martinez shook his head. Not enough time. Even if we could move boats fast enough, we're talking about nearly 200,000 people. The rebels would launch their attack long before we could evacuate even a fraction of the population. General Morrison continued the briefing with a weight of impossible choices. Every conventional option has been exhausted. Ground forces can't reach the chemical weapons site without massive casualties. Naval bombardment would destroy half the city along with the target. High-altitude bombing lacks the precision needed to ensure complete destruction of the chemical weapons. Sarah looked at the tactical displays showing the rebel chemical weapons facility. It was located in a heavily defended compound 3 miles inland from Maravita, surrounded by surface-to-air missile sites and protected by multiple layers of defensive positions. What's the intelligence on the facility layout? It's a converted industrial complex, replied the intelligence officer. The chemical weapons are stored in underground bunkers that would survive conventional bombing. We need surgical strikes that can penetrate the bunkers and ensure complete destruction of the chemical agents. Sarah studied the approach routes to the target. Every possible path was covered by multiple air defense systems. Worse, the facility was positioned near a school and medical clinic that the rebels had deliberately chosen to complicate any military response. Ma'am, I need detailed structural plans for those underground bunkers. Already prepared, General Morrison replied, handing her a classified folder. Captain, I'll be direct with you. This mission has a very low probability of success. The approach routes are essentially impassable. The target is extremely difficult, and escape would require flying through every air defense system in the region. Sarah opened the folder and studied the technical drawings of the chemical weapons facility. The bunkers were reinforced concrete structures designed to survive artillery bombardment. Destroying them would require precision strikes that penetrated specific structural weak points. Sir, what's the collateral damage assessment if those chemical weapons are deployed against civilians? Conservative estimates suggest 50,000 casualties in the first hour, General Morrison replied quietly. Total casualties could reach 100,000 before the chemical agents dissipate. Sarah felt the familiar weight of impossible expectations, but this time the stakes were higher than anything she had previously faced. Failure would mean the deaths of innocent civilians on a scale that would define the humanitarian crisis for generations. General, I'll need complete operational autonomy for this mission. No radio contact, no external coordination, no oversight that could compromise tactical decisions. Granted, this is your operation, Captain. What do you need? Sarah spent the next 90 minutes in the most intensive mission planning of her career. The chemical weapons facility was defended by air defenses that made her previous operations look simple by comparison. Approaching the target would require flying through a corridor of surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and radar-guided weapon systems. More critically, the underground bunkers containing chemical weapons required precisely placed explosives to ensure complete destruction. Sarah would need to achieve targeting accuracy measured in feet, not yards, while flying through defensive fire that would challenge her aircraft's survivability. She selected weapons specifically designed for bunker penetration, missiles with delayed fuse warheads that could punch through reinforced concrete before detonating. Her aircraft was loaded with additional fuel tanks for extended range and electronic countermeasures to confuse enemy radar systems. Ghost, weather conditions are marginal, reported the meteorology officer. Scattered thunderstorms with moderate turbulence. Visibility will be near zero until dawn. Perfect, Sarah replied. Storm cover will mask the approach. At 0530 hours, Sarah taxied her aircraft toward the runway for a mission that would either prevent a humanitarian catastrophe or result in her death, attempting the impossible. The pre-flight checks took on special significance. Every system needed to function perfectly because there would be no opportunity for backup plans or alternative approaches. Ghost, tower clears you for takeoff. Good luck. Sarah advanced the throttles and began her roll down the runway, feeling the familiar acceleration that transformed a sophisticated machine into an instrument of surgical precision. Within minutes, she was climbing into storm clouds that would provide cover for her approach to the most heavily defended target she had ever faced. The flight to the operational area took 47 minutes through weather that would have challenged commercial airlines to maintain basic navigation. Sarah flew through thunderstorms and turbulence while studying her targeting systems and rehearsing the attack sequence that would need to be executed with perfect timing. 15 miles from the target, she descended to 500 feet above ground level and began her approach through terrain that had been mapped and remapped during weeks of preparation. The chemical weapons facility was positioned in a valley surrounded by hills that provided natural defensive positions for enemy air defenses. Sarah's electronic warfare systems immediately detected multiple radar installations attempting to track her aircraft. Surface-to-air missile sites were activating as enemy forces realized that something was approaching through the storm. Within minutes, the night sky would be filled with deadly projectiles seeking her aircraft. Time to find out what ghost really means, she whispered to herself. Sarah activated her electronic countermeasures and dove toward the valley floor, using terrain masking to break radar locks while simultaneously avoiding surface-to-air missiles that were launching from multiple positions. Her aircraft defensive systems worked overtime to confuse enemy targeting while she maneuvered through a maze of hills and ridges. The first missile passed 50 feet from her aircraft. Sarah rolled inverted and pulled maximum G-forces while diving behind a ridgeline that temporarily blocked enemy radar. Her aircraft shuddered under stress loads that pushed structural limits, but she emerged from the valley at exactly the right position to begin her attack run. The chemical weapons facility appeared in her targeting systems, a complex of buildings and underground bunkers that contained enough chemical agents to kill every civilian in Maravita. Sarah had one opportunity to destroy the facility completely before enemy defenses could adjust to her attack pattern. She lined up her first missile on the primary chemical storage bunker, calculating penetration angles that would ensure complete destruction of the underground facility. The targeting computer showed a perfect lock. Sarah squeezed the trigger and watched her missile streak toward its target. The explosion was precisely controlled, punching through the reinforced concrete and detonating inside the bunker with enough force to destroy the chemical weapons stored there. But Sarah had 5 more targets that needed to be eliminated before the chemical threat was completely neutralized. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around her as rebel forces responded to the attack. Sarah maneuvered between tracers and explosions while acquiring locks on the remaining chemical storage bunkers. Her second missile eliminated another underground facility, sending secondary explosions that indicated complete destruction of its contents. But enemy defensive fire was intensifying as more weapons systems came online. Sarah's aircraft was hit by shrapnel from an anti-aircraft shell that exploded close enough to damage her left wing. Warning lights illuminated her cockpit as hydraulic pressure began dropping in critical flight control systems. She continued the attack despite aircraft damage that would have caused most pilots to abort the mission. Her third missile destroyed the facility's production equipment, ensuring that chemical agents couldn't be manufactured on site. Her fourth missile eliminated the storage facility for chemical weapon delivery systems. 2 targets remained, the command bunker and the final chemical storage facility. But Sarah's aircraft was losing hydraulic fluid and becoming increasingly difficult to control. Enemy fire had damaged systems that were essential for precision targeting. Sarah climbed toward the command bunker while fighting degraded flight controls that required constant attention. Her targeting system was operating on backup power with reduced accuracy. She would need to compensate for equipment failures while flying through defensive fire that was becoming more accurate as enemy forces adjusted to her attack patterns. Her fifth missile struck the command bunker with surgical precision, eliminating the facility's operational capability and preventing any coordinated response to her attack. But the final target, the largest chemical storage facility, remained operational. Sarah banked toward the last bunker while her aircraft systems continued failing. Hydraulic pressure was critically low, electrical systems were damaged, and fuel consumption had increased due to combat maneuvering. She was operating on backup systems with limited capability. But the final target contained the largest concentration of chemical weapons. Failing to destroy, it would leave enough chemical agents to kill thousands of civilians. Sarah steadied her damaged aircraft and acquired a targeting lock on the bunker that posed the greatest threat to innocent people. Her final missile punched through the reinforced concrete and detonated with an explosion that could be seen for miles. Secondary explosions indicated that every chemical weapon in the facility had been completely destroyed. The threat to Maravita's civilian population had been eliminated. But Sarah's escape was just beginning. Her aircraft was severely damaged, enemy air defenses were fully activated, and she was flying through hostile territory with backup systems that might fail at any moment. She climbed toward the mountain ridges that would provide cover for her withdrawal, but her damaged aircraft was losing altitude and speed. Warning lights indicated multiple system failures, and her fuel consumption was higher than planned due to combat damage. Sarah nursed her crippled aircraft through the mountains for 38 minutes, flying on backup systems while emergency warnings filled her cockpit. She was losing hydraulic fluid, electrical power was fluctuating, and fuel consumption calculations suggested she might not reach friendly territory. When she finally crossed into friendly airspace, Sarah's aircraft was operating on emergency systems with minimal capability. She declared an in-flight emergency and prepared for a landing that would test her skills with a damaged aircraft that was barely controllable. The landing approach required techniques that pushed her damaged aircraft beyond normal operating limits. Sarah compensated for failed hydraulic systems while managing electrical failures that affected critical flight instruments. She touched down on the runway with minimal fuel remaining and hydraulic systems that failed completely during the landing roll. Fire trucks and emergency personnel were waiting when she shut down her engines. Sarah climbed out of her aircraft, knowing that she had just prevented a humanitarian catastrophe that would have defined modern history. General Morrison was among the first people to reach her aircraft. Ghost, preliminary intelligence indicates complete destruction of the chemical weapons facility. You've saved more lives than most people save in entire careers. That morning, Sarah received a phone call from the hospital in Maravita, where international aid workers were treating civilian casualties from the 3-month siege. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the chief medical officer, spoke with exhaustion and gratitude that transcended language barriers. Captain Chun, I don't know what you did last night, but our chemical detection equipment registered massive explosions from the direction of the rebel chemical weapons facility. Whatever threat those weapons pose to our patients has been eliminated. Sarah realized that her success was measured not in tactical achievements or career advancement, but in children who would grow up without exposure to chemical weapons, families who would remain together instead of becoming casualties, and a community that would survive because someone had been willing to fly through impossible conditions when no alternatives existed. 6 months later, the siege of Maravita was broken by conventional forces who finally achieved tactical advantages that Sarah's night operations had made possible. The city was liberated with minimal casualties because the most dangerous weapons had been eliminated before they could be used against civilians. Sarah Chun, now Major Chun, received recognition for operations that officially never happened. Her innovations in night combat tactics became classified doctrine that would influence military aviation for generations. But the most meaningful recognition came from her parents, who finally understood why their daughter had chosen to accept responsibility for problems that only she could solve. The woman they had called Ghost as an insult had become a legend whispered about by enemy forces who learned to fear the darkness where she operated. But Sarah knew that her greatest achievement wasn't tactical innovation or military recognition. It was proving that individual courage, properly applied, could protect innocent people from threats that entire armies couldn't address. In the end, they stopped laughing about her call sign because they realized what Ghost really meant. It meant precision in darkness, surgical strikes in impossible conditions, and the willingness to risk everything when the lives of innocent people hung in the balance. Major Sarah Chun, call sign Ghost, had become exactly what her parents had always known she could be. Someone who used extraordinary capabilities to solve problems that no one else could handle, protecting people who would never know her name, but whose lives were forever changed by her willingness to fly into the darkness where others feared to go.